Hi, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the assumptions session of the Theory of Change module. And just a quick heads up that if you were trained as a facilitator for the Theory of Change module prior to May 2024, this is a new version of this session, along with the new intermediate results session as well. So you will want to review this video. So starting off, the assumption sessions, I guess backing up a little bit, assumptions can be one of those elements of the theory of change that is a little harder cognitively for folks to wrap heads around. They are usually phrased as positive statements, and there are things that we often accept as true or certain to happen, but they are assumptions because they may not be true. And if they're not true, there are potential consequences to our project success and the way that we should be working. So I guess they're positive statements, but they're also like potentially untrue or invalid. So it's worth just sort of pausing and making sure that everyone who's a participant in the workshop has sort of like the same idea or context around what an assumption is. We also did include here a little example of sort of like thinking about a strategic approach and a potential long-term outcome and what some example assumptions in between those might be, just to give folks a sense of like what types of things are we talking about or thinking about when we think about assumptions. So we do recommend also before getting started with this session that you, as a facilitator, fill out this context, bringing in work from previous sessions of the workshop so that everyone can sort of see all of this content as they get into brainstorming assumptions. And one thing I should also mention before going into talking about how this exercise is structured is that in the mural board, you will see that there are 4 different panels for this assumptions exercise. They're all duplicates of each other. The intent is that you would do one of these panels for each of the strategic approaches in the theory of change. So you might actually need to duplicate and create more panels or even delete one. But the way that we would normally recommend facilitating through this is that you actually, especially if you have a larger group, you split into breakout groups for each breakout group to focus on one strategic approach. It is potentially, kind of depending on like how many breakout groups you're able to do and how many assumptions you're able to double thread. In time, the timing of this workshop could work out really differently for you. One other tip for you is that given that you may not have enough time scheduled to get through assumptions for all the strategic approaches, we do recommend that you get all the way through assumptions and intermediate results for a subset of the strategic approaches with your full group workshop time if you're limited, rather than very carefully like finishing all of the assumptions for every single strategic approach before moving on to IRs, if that makes sense. Just because giving the team and the participant group a sense of how everything fits together, even for just a portion of the content, is more powerful generally than not getting all the way through to intermediate results. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So once you've sort of taken the time to kind of set the stage and help people get on the same page and get aligned about what an assumption is, you are ready to start brainstorming assumptions. So the way that we have designed this exercise is that this is a place for you to put in the strategic approach this panel is focused on, and the relevant outcomes that this strategic approach will hopefully be leading towards. And then there's this big middle space, we call it the magic middle land, where change happens, because if we've stated in a strategic approach, there's likely a lot of stuff that has to happen in the middle, in between our sort of implementation and the ultimate outcome. And so the way we frame or prompt folks for this brainstorm is thinking about what change in the world are we assuming will take place as a result of our work as we move towards the outcomes? Who will change, what will change, and how will it change? Another way to think about this or frame it is if we're doing X strategic approach, then Y will occur. Something will occur as a result. And so as the team kind of gets into thinking about what these changes are, one thing we found is really helpful as a facilitator is to let the team off the hook in terms of having to perfectly state assumptions as positive statements. If an example assumption is that our incentive program for landowners will get enough interest and landowners will want to sign up for it. That assumption could be framed as a statement or a question. Will landowners sign up for our incentive program? Will the incentives be strong enough? Or it could also be even framed as sort of an intermediate result type of thing. We'll have enough landowners sign up for our program that we'll be able to justify moving forward. So any of those formats, I guess my point here is any of those formats should be totally welcome here at this stage. We don't want to get like overly hung up on that. All of those things could be reframed as an assumption pretty easily. And the important thing is to get the right concepts out so that we start to see how the different pieces of this chain fit together to build a bridge between the action and the outcomes. And so, yeah, brainstorming on these stickies, and then, oops, I got to bring those to the front. This is a good reminder for facilitators that if you are not bringing the sticky notes to the front before using a lot of these boards, then they will disappear behind the shape. But so the brainstorming would happen onto these sticky notes, and then folks could bring them down onto this board. And then at some point, we sort of suggest doing a bunch of brainstorming and then doing a moment where you take all the brainstormed assumptions and try to roughly place them in temporal order. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 in a linear chain. But as long as the earlier stage assumptions, the ones that matter earlier on in the project versus later on, those are roughly organized in that order. So once you've had a chance to sort of get all those assumptions out and organize them in temporal order roughly, then there's a bit of a special energy vote prompt for this session. So what we're encouraging folks to think about is two different types of assumptions. The first type is a type of assumption where it's more urgent because it's earlier on in the temporal chain, and it also has low evidence or high risk is another way to think about it. So the prompt here is, hey, let's focus on the earlier part of the chain and think about which assumptions in this earlier part of the chain represent pretty big risks, or they really might not actually be true or valid assumptions. And the reason we're focusing earlier on in the causal chain for this prompt is that the assumptions that come earlier on in that causal chain or logic chain, they matter more because if they end up being untrue, the assumptions later on in the chain often don't matter at all. Like if we can't get landowners to stick with our same example, if we can't get landowners interested in the incentive program, then our ability to change their behavior through that incentive program matters way less because we might have to pivot our strategy overall. The second prompt for this energy vote is considering assumptions that pose the most significant risk to the strategy overall. Another way to say this is they're the most important overall assumptions that must be true for the strategic approach to pan out. A really good example of this is thinking about like a team that's trying to get policy changes passed. And so an assumption around like getting that policy actually implemented or adopted might be like a really core critical overall assumption. And we also, again, in this case, want to be focusing on assumptions that have low evidence to support them. So policy might be a good example of that because it's pretty hard to have very strong evidence that a policy would get passed ahead of it actually passing. Yeah, that's just one example. Again, we want to really be thinking about sort of those linchpin assumptions that need to be true in order for the strategic approach to pan out. So once you've sort of had this energy vote and then sort of a subsequent discussion to consider as a group, what are sort of the key assumptions for this strategic approach, we recommend moving forward with one or two assumptions for that strategic approach, maybe three, but the really trying to pick one or two that can serve you in the next exercise as we get into a discussion about intermediate results will be where you want to try to land. And then finally, we have this little gut check here. Do our assumptions represent real risks we should be considering? Are they actionable? As in we can test if they're true or change our approach if they're not. If they're not as actionable, an example of it, an not actionable assumption might be that the political environment is going to stay relatively stable over the course of the project. Or that's a very contextual assumption that we might not really have much influence over. We can't do much about it if it changes, at least not right now. And so that, we want to really be sticking to thinking about assumptions that we have at least for the context of our theory of change, those assumptions that are really embedded in the logic of our work. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. That's about assumptions. And in the next video, I'm going to get into how we put these assumptions to use to help us build our intermediate results.